Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved.
Good evening, everybody. How are we all? Alright, we are finishing up the chapter tonight on, what's it called? The Realm of Spirits. And then we've got one more chapter in this book. And I'm trying to figure out my list for the next poll to see what book we go into. But haven't quite got all four of them figured out yet, so we'll get there. I'll finalize it tomorrow and put up the poll so that by next weekend we know what the next book is. Clean off these glasses a little bit here. Alright. Settle back in, and here we go. I stopped right there. Okay. So, the Realm of Spirits. Almost the end of it. We'll finish the chapter, like I said. So, like 20 some odd pages. Where do we draw the line between mental and physical powers, between the normal and the psychic? When I bend my fingers, my nerves carry a message from my brain to the hand, but I have no idea of what happens in physical terms. I do not make my fingers bend. There seems to be no intermediate process between wanting them to bend and bending them. Is this any less mysterious than the power of the electric eel to discharge 600 volts, or Angelique Cotton's knack of making heavy objects jump when she approached them? Jewel Eisenbud, MD, a member of the University of Colorado Medical School in Denver, has devoted a whole book to his amazing researches into the power of an alcoholic bellhop, Ted Serios, who can cause photographs to appear on a film by merely concentrating on the camera. Dr. Eisenbud's book also illustrates the phenomenon I spoke of in the introduction to his book, the firm desire of ordinary people to ignore anything they cannot explain and pretend it has never happened. Wow, doesn't that sound familiar? Dr. Eisenbud was bothered by the problem of the non-repeatableness of most psychic phenomena and wrote an article in which he said he looked forward to a more satisfactory phase in the history of psychical research. Someone thereupon sent him a paper that had been printed in Fate, describing the magazine Fate, describing how Serios could produce photographs by staring into the camera's lens with great concentration. The report stated that tests had been carried out over a number of months by scientists and photographers. Dr. Eisenbud's first response was to wonder why the hell, in that case, this wasn't a subject of general knowledge. Why the hell, in that case, this wasn't a subject of general knowledge. Okay. Then he decided that the answer must be that the people involved had not conducted their experiments with the necessary care and rigor. However, he eventually agreed to see a demonstration in Chicago. Ted Serios, a small, thin man, turned up in the hotel lobby, rather to Eisenbud's surprise, since he had been warned about the psychic's alcoholism. In the hotel room, Serios took a Polaroid camera loaded with film, stared into the lens with an intense concentration that made the veins stand out on his forehead, then relaxed after 20 seconds or so. The print, when taken out of the camera, was black. He tried 7 more times before a plate came out with a dim, blurry picture of a tower-like building on it, which a lady present identified as the Chicago Water Tower. Serios complained of headache. He had drunk a certain amount of whiskey. After a rest, there were more tries, and one of these produced another blurry but unmistakable picture of a hotel front with the word Stevens across it. It was a hotel that had burned down some years before. Eisenbud was understandably excited. He writes, quote, I had also tried to show that it was necessary to postulate that we all had latent capacities to do unconsciously essentially what Ted was doing. In order to close in on what to my mind was the number one problem in science, the phenomena of precognition, end quote. He adds, quote, now here it was just as predicted, like the planet Pluto, end quote. He proceeded to ring up people who ought to be interested, and some professors who had seen the phenomenon agreed it was probably genuine. The result was a blank. They agreed it was genuine, but couldn't be bothered to investigate further. Quote, so a guy takes pictures with his mind, so what, end quote, said one magazine editor. One professor explained that he had lost interest because in one of the photographs, Serios had got the wrong building. Eisenbud says that it reminds him of the joke about the talking horse that ends, don't believe a word that horse says, he's a pathological liar, end quote. Serios's claim to be included in this chapter lies in the way he developed his thought photography. In 1955, he was working as a bellhop in a Chicago hotel when a fellow employee discovered that he was an exceptionally good hypnotic subject, and under hypnosis, Serios became a traveling clairvoyant, quote-unquote, a subject already discussed in an earlier chapter, and journeyed mentally to distant places. On these mental expeditions, he made the acquaintance of a spirit who claimed to be Jean Lafitte, a pirate and smuggler who died in the early 19th century. And Lafitte took Sirius to spots where he claimed buried treasure was hidden. An expedition to Florida to uncover some of this treasure was a failure, and Lafitte seems to have got bored with his new acquaintance, for he became more difficult to summon up, until he vanished altogether. In spite of this, Ted's powers of scrying turned up a few minor finds, and at one point a syndicate was formed to exploit it. Several $100s were unearthed at one spot, but a rival syndicate had got there first. One of the problems was pinpointing the spots where the treasure was hidden, and at this point Sirius's fellow employee, George Johannes, handed him an ordinary camera and told him to try that. The resulting photographs astounded Sirius, who thought at first that Johannes was pulling his leg. He bought his own camera and got the same results. Finally, ill health forced him to give up scrying, and one psychiatrist even convinced him that the whole thing had been some sort of an illusion. Eisenbud arrived on the scene after many years of ups and downs. Eisenbud got Sirius to Denver and began a series of tests. In the first one, Sirius managed to get a recognizable shot of the clock tower of Westminster Abbey. He had seen a photograph of it in a magazine the day before. A group of professors present were sufficiently impressed to sign testimonials about what they had witnessed. Eisenbud's account of Sirius does not reveal a strong personality. Endless talk about himself, jejune talk about his attitude to the opposite sex, a large daily consumption of whiskey. He failed to arrive. Okay, and now I understand that sentence. It was a little bit. He failed to arrive for his second big demonstration, fleeing back to Chicago and making various excuses. Returning later, he irritated the committee of professors prepared to bear witness by getting incoherently drunk. Then, sensing that everybody's patience had reached a limit, he grabbed the camera, concentrated hard, and produced an excellent photograph of a double-decker bus with the remark, "Put that in your pipe and smoke it." Eisenbud's book, The World of Ted Sirius, 1967, contains over 100 of these mental pictures and reproductions of various pictures that he had in mind when trying. There is immense variety: buildings, sometimes in color, cars, people, rockets, and many weird and unidentifiable shapes. The usual method of taking them was as follows. Sirius would take a small plastic tube, which he called a gizmo, and hold it over the lens of the camera. Then concentrate very hard and press the trigger of the camera. Anyone who has used a Polaroid will know that such a procedure would normally produce a blur. The camera and film were produced, but Dr. Eisenbud or anyone else were produced. What? The camera and film were produced by Dr. Eisenbud or anyone else present. Sirius would produce a photograph, whether or not there was a lens in the camera, and whether or not he was blindfolded. He usually had a fairly clear idea of what the picture would be, and on occasion was quite certain that it had been successful. When trying to get the Chicago Hilton, he muttered, "Missed, damn it," and produced the Denver Hilton instead, in color. Almost as remarkable as Ted Sirius's photography was the reaction of people approached by Eisenbud for cooperation. At a meeting where he was describing his results, one friend and colleague grunted, quote, "Don't believe it," and walked out. Another became insulting. A third suggested that Sirius should be stripped. If Eisenbud had been asking them to attend a séance, this kind of reaction might be understandable, but he was only asking for help in a controlled scientific experiment. Why should people react in this way? The answer surely is that there is still a gulf between science and quote-unquote paranormal phenomena. Like the gulf between science and religion, and normal, rational people react to tales of the paranormal as they might react to a religious crank trying to force his way in through the front door. Besides, there is some justification for the remark of the editor, quote, "So a guy takes a pictures with his mind, so what?" End quote. If we consider Sirius's photographs or Daniel Douglas Hume's levitation in isolation, they are strange, but they have no connection with everyday life. And if they have no connection, then they are certainly interesting but irrelevant, and busy people are right to ignore them. Eisenbud agrees that at present there is no connection, but he cites the story of Faraday, who was asked by 3 tax inspectors why His Majesty's government should continue to support experiments with electrical jars. Faraday replied, quote, "I'm not quite sure myself where all this is going, but maybe someday it will be taxable." End quote. If Sirius can produce pictures with his mind, what is to stop anybody doing it? There are powers involved here that we probably all possess but are unaware of. What if Sirius's manifestations are the equivalent of Faraday's Leyden jars, the beginning of the discovery of a far bigger phenomena? After all, the Leyden jar must have struck businessmen of the 19th century as an odd but limited phenomena. You could produce sparks with it and electrocute chickens, but so what? Who could guess that the Leyden jar would lead to the electric generator? Whether Eisenbud is correct to believe that precognition and mind photography are somehow connected is a question that must be considered in the final chapter. The active powers of Sirius and the passive powers of mediums seem to be diametrically opposed. It is true that Sirius can sometimes see photographs in a sealed envelope and reproduce them on a Polaroid plate, but according to Eisenbud's account, he is wrong more often than not. On the other hand, most psychics simply have the power to see things that other people cannot see, and even in this field, the powers vary widely. Peter Hurkos and Gerard Croisset can sense an object's history by touching it. Tom Corbett, of whom Diana Vernon has written at length in The Stately Ghosts of England, 1963, can sense the presence and nature of ghosts in haunted houses, but may or may not sense something about the person to whom he is speaking. Corbett explained to Mrs. Vernon, quote, "I haven't got any power over the ghosts, like exorcising them or telling them to go away, but if there's a ghost around, I can tell you where and sometimes what it looks like. Other people have this gift in varying degrees. Some, like me, see them, some hear them, others just sense them. Most people, of course, aren't psychic at all, so they won't ever see a ghost, even if it's standing right beside them." End quote. Corbett's observations about ghosts throw some interesting light on the basic problem raised in this chapter. At Longleat, the home of the Marquis of Bath, Corbett was asked to give his opinion on 2 alleged ghosts, one in a corridor known as Green Lady's Walk, the other supposedly of a bishop in the library. To begin with, Corbett was deliberately shown the wrong corridor by way of testing him. He immediately recognized that it was the wrong corridor and led the way to another one, which led off the first. Quote, "Something dreadful happened here. This is your corridor, not the other one." End quote. As it happened, the name of the something dreadful was known. The Marquis of Bath, or Marquis of Bath, in the time of Queen Anne, caught his wife in flagrante delicto with her young lover. A sword fight ensued that ended with the lover being run through. The lover was, according to legend, buried in the cellars, and the Marquis moved out, and lived for the rest of his life at a nearby village. When the present Marquis of Bath was a young man, the story was verified when workmen installing central heating found the skeleton under the cellar flags. But the ghost, according to Corbett, is not that of the lover or of the avenging Marquis, but of a woman, almost certainly Lady Louisa Carteret, the lady in question. Corbett acknowledged that he could not state definitely that the ghost was Lady Louisa, but added, quote, "A spirit retains the identity and sex it had when it was alive. The men, the lover and the marquis, can't haunt, presumably because they had what it takes to progress, while Louisa's grief kept her shackled here." End quote. He also explained that ghosts have no sense of time and that they are therefore unaware of the passing of the centuries. When shown the library in which the ghost of Bishop Ken was supposed to appear on the anniversary of his death, Corbett asserted that it was not haunted, and that in any sense ghosts are not observers of anniversaries. If time stands still for them, this is logical. However, he was able to verify the presence of a friendlier spirit in another library in the house, pointing out the exact spot where the librarian had frequently sensed its presence. He was able to add that the ghost was almost certainly the builder of Longleat, a Sir John Tyne, a wealthy Elizabethan, which explains his attachment to it. In another corridor of the house, Corbett stopped and rapped with his knuckles on a door. He could not explain why he did it, but the librarian explained that when she had slept in that room, there had been a knock on the door every night at about the same time. It happened so often that she ended by ignoring it. Corbett's verdict on the house was, quote, "Certainly two very strong ghosts, and one in the corridor and the one in the Red Library. Then there's another, very faint, which causes the knock on Miss Coates' door. There's a heavy malevolence in the linen cupboard, caused, I think, by someone who was probably once a housekeeper, a most unpleasant woman. All the hauntings are done independently, and each ghost is unaware of the other's existence. But our intrusion wasn't welcome, I'm afraid. The Bishop of Ken doesn't haunt, by the way." End quote. The comment about being unwelcome seemed to be verified when Corbett, Mrs. Vernon, and the photographer who had accompanied them all fell ill after the visit to Longleat. This chapter could be incomplete without some discussion of the evidence for reincarnation, the doctrine of the rebirth of the spirit in different bodies. The Greeks called it metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. The belief is so widespread as to be almost universal. It can be found among the ancient Egyptians, the Hindus, the American Indians, and in the folklore of Europe and Africa. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, quote, "You and I, Arjuna, have lived many lives. I remember them all. You do not remember." End quote. The doctrine of reincarnation, as found among the Hindus and Buddhists, is in some ways a flat contradiction of the Christian notion that eternal bliss or eternal punishment may be the outcome of a man's activities during a single lifetime. The Hindus assert that the soul returns to earth again and again, moving higher or lower according to the degree of perfection it achieved in its previous incarnation. A great chain of being descends from the ultimate Godhead to the lowest forms of dead matter, and everything has its place on it. Man stands midway between matter and spirit, and his problem is to move upward. Reincarnation also plays an important part in the Kabbalah. The Society for Psychical Research has paid less attention to cases of reincarnation than to various forms of psychical phenomena. Myers devotes only one page to it in his Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, and although he accepts the doctrine, he also points out the objections to it. In the long run, all spirits are bound to progress. So the generality of men today ought to be altogether more moral and idealistic than the men of 5,000 years ago. This hardly seems to be true. In the same way, if the reward for success in a previous existence is to be born at a more comfortable level, then the aristocracy ought to be on a spiritually higher level than the polloi, an arguable assertion. In 1956, the subject In 1956, the subject of reincarnation became the most popular topic of the day when a Pueblo, Colorado businessman called Maury Bernstein published his accounts of hypnotizing a local housewife named Virginia Teague. Under hypnosis, Mrs. Teague clearly recalled her previous existence as an Irish girl named uh, Bridie Murphy. The search for Bridie Murphy topped the national bestseller list for weeks and was almost as popular in England. Edgar Cayce had asserted the reality of reincarnation since 1923, but the Bridie Murphy case seemed more conclusive and more spectacular than any of Cayce's examples. Then the bubble burst. The house in which Mrs. Teague had been brought up was found to resemble the one in which Bridie Murphy had lived in Cork. It was discovered that one of her childhood neighbors had actually been called Bridie Murphy, different spelling, and that Mrs. Teague had once been in love with her son. It was finally established beyond all reasonable doubt that most of the things that had happened to Bridie Murphy had also happened to Mrs. Teague. The Chicago American published a shattering expose of Bridie Murphy, and the craze ended as suddenly as it had begun. Professor C.J. Ducasse, or Ducasse, D-U-C-A-S-S-E, Ducasse, of Brown University, published a book on the belief in life after death in which he completely exonerated Mrs. Teague from all suspicion of fraud and defended Bernstein as a serious and dedicated student of hypnosis and reincarnation, but for most Americans the case was closed. This was a pity, for the serious evidence for reincarnation is as convincing, if not quite so voluminous, as that for life after death. Volume 26 of the Proceedings of the American SPR is devoted to 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation by Ian Stevenson, MD. These cases, selected from more than 200 investigated by the Society, have the usual thorough documentation. Most of them seem to follow a certain pattern. A child of between 2 and 4 years old begins describing events and people in a previous existence. The parents decide to look into it, and the details are found to be accurate. Such stories are not unfamiliar. For example, the case of Shanti Devi can be found in Frank Edwards' Stranger Than Science. She was born in Delhi in 1926. When she was 7, she informed her parents that she had been born before in a town called Mathura, in parentheses, Mathura. She described her life in some detail, how she had been married and had 3 children. She died when giving birth to the third. Her name, she said, had been Ludgi. Her parents assumed this was pure imagination, but in 1935 a man called at the house on business, and Shanti Devi stared with amazement, declaring that he was her husband's cousin. The man confirmed that he was from Mathura and that he had a cousin who had lost his wife, named Ludgi, in childbirth 10 years earlier. Ludgi's husband was brought to the house without telling the girl he was expected. She recognized him instantly and threw herself into his arms. Taken to Mathura, she was able to point out various people and places correctly and converse with relatives of the dead Ludgi in local dialect, although Shanti Devi had been taught in Hindustani. A scientific commission which investigated the case found that she was able to direct a carriage through the town even when she was blindfolded and recognize various landmarks. She recognized her 2 eldest children, but not the one whose birth had cost her her life. Ian Stevenson mentions that Shanti Devi the Shanti Devi case in his book and adds that he has discovered that Ludgi's husband often came to Delhi and frequented a sweetmeat shop not far from Shanti Devi's home. There is no suggestion that Shanti Devi met her former husband there. Stevenson only mentions it to raise the hypothesis of some kind of telepathy, which he then rejects. I just want to see. I think I've got to go to like 235. Holy buckets. Okay, yeah. We have 20 pages to go. One of the most interesting points that emerges from Stevenson's book is that a large number of subjects who could recall previous lives had died a violent death in this earlier existence. This may explain the continuation of memory. A boy named Ravi Shankar, born in July 1951, later gave details of his murder in his previous existence. As a child of 6, he was killed and beheaded by a relative, aided by an accomplice, who hoped to inherit the property of the child's father. Ravi Shankar actually had a scar on his neck resembling a long knife wound. A child named Jasbir claimed to be a man who had been given poisoned sweets and had died as a result of a fall from a cart in which he had sustained a head injury. Imad Elawar, a Lebanese child born in 1958, had died of tuberculosis in his previous existence, but he had been unpleasantly shocked when a cousin had been run over by a truck driven by an enemy and died soon afterwards. Imad's earliest statements about his previous existence concerned this violent death. H. A. Wijeratne, born in Ceylon in 1947, had memories of the life of his paternal uncle, who had been hanged for the murder of his wife. Jimmy Svensson, a Tlingit Indian of southeastern Alaska, began to claim at the age of 2 that he was his maternal uncle, a man named Jimmy Sisko, who had died under mysterious circumstances, probably murdered. The child had marks on his abdomen resembling gunshot wounds. On the other hand, Swarnlata Mishra, the daughter of an inspector of schools in Madhya Pradesh, only recognized the scene of her previous life when she happened to be passing through the city of Katni on a journey with her father. She was 3.5 at the time. Norman Despers, a Tlingit Indian, was taken to visit a cove 35 miles away and suddenly asserted that he had once owned a smokehouse for smoking fish on the strait and had later gone blind. The description fitted his grandfather. The child was 3 at the time of the recognition scene. Some of the cases have extremely unusual features. Jasbir Lal Jat was 3.5 years old when he suddenly became Sobharam, the man who had fallen from the cart after eating poisoned sweets. But Sobharam did not die until Jasbir was 3.5. One day in the spring of 1954, Jasbir apparently died of smallpox. His father went to get help to bury him, but neighbors advised him to wait until the next day. Before morning, the child began to stir. When he eventually recovered, his personality had changed completely, and he began speaking about his previous existence. Unfortunately, he had been of the Brahmin caste in this existence, and his new family were Jats. The child declined to eat with them, and his food had to be cooked by a nearby Brahmin lady. It was only when he began to suspect that his family occasionally cheated him by cooking his food themselves that he decided to abandon himself to his new caste. When the child was taken to the village of Vehedi, some 20 miles away, he showed accurate and detailed knowledge of relatives, places, and events. The closeness of the village might give rise to the suspicion that Jazbir had visited Vehedi often enough to learn about Sobharam, but Stevenson points out that the two villages are accessible only by means of dirt roads, and that since they are on either side of the local market town, one to the north and one to the south, inhabitants of one would have little or no reason to visit the other. Stevenson always goes into the question of the relative locations of the places where his subjects lived before and after reincarnation. There are few cases where there could be the remotest possibility of the subject having visited the scene of his previous existence. Jazbir eventually came to spend as much time with his previous family as with his new one, showing great affection for his son, or rather, Sobharam's son. This also occurs in a number of cases cited by Stevenson, although in others the new family may show violent jealousy about the child's previous existence. There are several cases in which the child was beaten into silence about his other life. It is also interesting to note that memories of a previous existence often fade as the child grows older. Another noteworthy feature of many of the cases in Stevenson's book is that the subject seems to be able to choose where he will be reborn. Maria de Oliveira of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, deliberately contracted tuberculosis and died at the age of 28. She had two unhappy love affairs. She promised her friend Ida Lorenz that she would be reborn as her daughter. 10 months later, Ida gave birth to a daughter. At 2.5 years of age, this child began to speak of events in the life of the dead Maria, and gave detailed evidence of her knowledge of Maria's life. There were no less than 120 occasions on which she recognized previous acquaintances or made remarks that were later verified. Amelia Lorenz, also a Brazilian, committed suicide at 19 by swallowing cyanide. She hated being a girl and often said she would return to Earth as a man. After her death, her spirit made communication at seances and declared that she intended to rejoin her family, this time as a boy. Shortly thereafter, Mrs. Lorenz produced a boy, Paulo, who soon declared himself to be Amelia and exhibited markedly feminine traits. Again, Stevenson offers a 4-page table itemizing the evidence for identifying Paulo with Amelia. William George was a Tlingit fisherman who told his favorite son that he intended to return to Earth as his son, and that the evidence would be certain birthmarks identical with his own. He died mysteriously, vanishing from his fishing boat at sea in 1949. In May 1950, his daughter-in-law gave birth to a boy who had the predicted birthmarks. During her labor, she dreamed of her father-in-law, who told her he was anxious to see his son again. At 4 years of age, the boy, named after his grandfather, began to exhibit a knowledge of people and places in his grandfather's life, and to develop some of his characteristic mannerisms, including his walk. When he came in one day and found his mother going through a box of jewelry, he stated, "That's my watch," and grabbed a gold watch that had indeed been presented to his mother by William George Sr. His parents both asserted that he had never seen this watch before or heard of it. Altogether, 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation is a convincing, if bewildering, volume, carrying the stamp of authenticity throughout. The conclusions it seems to suggest may be tabulated as follows. A. Reincarnation occurs all the time, but memory of previous existences is rare. It happens most frequently when the death was violent. B. Spirits seem to have a certain amount of choice about reincarnation. C. Cases in which C. Cases in which there is memory of a previous existence occurs most often among people who already accept the idea of reincarnation. D. More than one spirit may occupy the same body, as in the case of Jasbir. This last conclusion recalls the remark of the psychologist McDougall about Sally Beauchamp, that her other personalities seem to be separate psychic entities rather than aspects of the same person. The case of the Sinhalese murderer Wijaratne deserves further mention. Wijaratne was born in 1947 with a deformity of the right breast and arm. Because of his resemblance to the paternal uncle Ratranhami, his father remarked, quote, "This is my brother come back," end quote. The family assumed that the deformities were due to some bad karma from a previous existence. When the child was 2.5, his mother overheard him remarking that his arm was deformed because he had killed his wife. The child later related details of the crime and of the arrest and execution of Ratranhami in a way that convinced his parents that this was not imagination. Stevenson gives a full account of the boy's description of the murder. The crime had been due to a violent fit of temper. Wijaratne admitted that he had had an ungovernable temper in his previous existence, but that it was now improved. The girl had been married to Ratranhami, but had continued to live with her parents until the second half of a two-part ceremony should take place. When he called for her, she suddenly decided not to go with him, whereupon he drew a knife and stabbed her. At the trial, Ratranhami defended himself by saying that he had not intended to kill his wife. Her family had set upon him and were beating him while she held his arms. He stabbed her in freeing himself. The family claimed that he attacked her with a kris, a Malayan dagger, and that only then had they attacked him. Wijaratne acknowledged that the family account was the true one and that his execution was justified, adding nevertheless that he was faced with a similar situation again. If faced with a similar situation again, he would do the same thing. Stevenson mentions that he has many cases in which light has been thrown on a murder in this manner. The year 1956, the date of publication of The Search for Bridie Murphy, produced a number of other interesting cases of alleged reincarnation in England. Henry Blyth, a professional hypnotist of Torquay, Devon, hypnotized a 32-year-old Exeter housewife named Naomi Henry, whom he had earlier cured of smoking. A tape recorder was used at some of the sessions, and a long-playing record was subsequently issued on the Oriole label. First, a number of witnesses identified themselves, and Dr. William Minifee describes what is about to take place. Mrs. Henry is already asleep. The hypnotist takes her back in time to her childhood, then asks her about previous existences. She speaks of being an Irish girl, Mary Cohen, and gives the year as 1790. The hypnotist takes her to her wedding day, 4 years later, and she explains that she doesn't want to get married, that her mother has forced it upon her because she doesn't want to keep an unmarried daughter. Later, she dies as a result of a broken leg inflicted by her husband in the course of a beating. The hypnotist then takes her on 4 years beyond her death, and her breath ceases. The record sleeve asserts that her heart also stopped beating for 5 seconds. When she describes an incarnation as Clarice Hellier, a nurse born in 1880, and ends by describing her death from goitre, Goitre, and even the number of her grave. At the same time, the record sleeve makes it clear that the record is not intended to be proof of reincarnation, only an unusual experiment. This is perhaps as well. While the listener entertains no doubt of the sincerity of everyone involved, he is likely to find himself wondering whether the hypnotic subject is giving the answers that she knows are required out of a desire to please the hypnotist. One can see how easily the same thing may have occurred in the case of Bridie Murphy. Unless researchers can find definite proof of the existence of Mary Cohen in Cork in 1890, or Clarice Hellier in Downham, and there are no less than 6 places of that name in England, this kind of thing must be regarded simply as an interesting experiment. But this is not to say that deep hypnosis might not become a valuable instrument for investigating past incarnations. Arnaud Bloxham, an expert on old furniture, was also apparently stimulated by the Bridie Murphy case to use his hypnotic powers to investigate reincarnation. The result of his first experiments was a book, Who Was Anne Ockenden, written by his wife, Dulcie, in which a young girl under hypnosis describes her previous existence in prehistoric times. Mr. Bloxham has gone on to make many more similar experiments, recording all on tape, and has accumulated an immense library of recordings. A woman who claimed to be Henrietta, exiled sister of Charles II, showed detailed knowledge of the Stuart period and was able to describe in detail the court of Louis XIV and of his brother Philippe, Duke of the Orleans, to whom she was married. A man who recalled a previous existence as a naval gunner in the time of Napoleon gave so many authentic details about naval life at that time that Earl Mountbatten borrowed the tape to play to experts on naval history. One can only say that if experiments like this are carried on for long enough and on a sufficiently widespread scale, there are bound to be cases where authenticity cannot be challenged. Robert Heinlein predicted in Amazing Stories for April 1956 that by the year 2001, reincarnation would have been demonstrated with scientific rigor, and there seems a fair possibility that he will be proved right. Maybe not. Arthur Gurdam is a well-known English psychiatrist who was, until his recent retirement, senior consultant in psychiatry to the Bath clinical area. He is also a believer in reincarnation. His pamphlet, Religious Aspects of Extrasensory Perception, opens with the challenging sentence, quote, "The study of parapsychology will be the next major development in psychiatry," end quote. He goes on to argue that certain psychological illnesses may be quite literally psychic in origin, due to powers of extrasensory perception or to dream memories of previous incarnations. He adds, quote, "I have a patient whose capacity to add to the knowledge of European medieval history has been recognized by 2 professors of the subject," end quote. This patient, a woman, was an exponent of Catharsism, the sect we have already encountered in connection with the origins of witchcraft. Quote, "Without ever studying it, she has a detailed knowledge of its ritual and practices. She acquired some of this knowledge from dreams, others from her recurrent nightmare, and from what she calls visions, but most of it was provided by stories and notes she felt impelled to write as a schoolgirl in her early teens. It is utterly impossible that she could have had access to the detailed literature of Catharism at that age," end quote. He cites one of the proofs that the patient's visions were authentic. "She insisted to me that the priest with whom she was associated wore dark blue robes, and it is more than 20 years since she was first aware of this fact. It is only in the last 2 or 3 years that it has been established that they sometimes wore dark blue or dark green," end quote. He adds that it would take a full-length book to detail all the other evidence of his patient's knowledge of Catharism. In 1970, Girdham published this book, The Cathars and Reincarnation, and it is certainly one of the most remarkable and controversial documents ever printed on this subject. The author has deliberately avoided the kind of dramatic treatment that made Bridie Murphy a bestseller, and many readers may feel he has moved too far in the opposite direction, allowing the story to become too overburdened with the details of his historical researches. But the result is one of the most convincing accounts of reincarnation that exist in English. The story begins with a series of odd coincidences. In March 1962, Dr. Girdham says the patient, whom he calls Mrs. Smith, who was suffering from nightmares accompanied by screams. The dreams were always of a man who entered a room as she lay on the floor. His approach filled her with terror. Oddly enough, Dr. Girdham had himself suffered from an almost identical nightmare until shortly before meeting Mrs. Smith. From the beginning, the subject of the Cathars was involved in this odd chain of coincidence. Since before the war, Dr. Girdham had been fascinated by the Pyrenees, and particularly by Montségur, where he discovered later a great massacre of Cathars had taken place in 1244. 18 months after he met Mrs. Smith, the subject of Catharism began to recur with increasing frequency. Quote, "To this day, only a few people in England know anything about the Cathars, but it seems that it is preordained that sooner or later I will meet all of them." End quote. In December 1963, he spoke to Mrs. Smith about the Pyrenees, where she had spent a holiday, and mentioned the Cathars. She was startled, for she had come across the name for the first time earlier that afternoon. She had casually opened a book in the library, found a chapter on Catharism, and become fascinated by the subject. It was later the same day that Dr. Girdham came across the name of Little Gaddesden in a book on the Pyrenees, and encountered the name of the inn he had been trying to remember all day. On another occasion, Dr. Girdham's wife read a magazine article in the Hairdressers in which the writer speculated that the order of Bonsoms at Eddington in Wiltshire derived from the Cathars. That the order of Bonsoms. Yeah. Bonsoms is the name by which the Cathars of Languedoc were known. Would that be bonhommes? Bon being good, good men? Isn't Holmes, Hommes? Is that, am I remembering my French correctly? It's been 30 plus years, so I may be wrong there. Dr. Girdham wrote to the author and discovered that it was one of his own patients with whom he had never discussed Catharism. When he and his wife attended a cocktail party, he met an RAF officer who had climbed Montségur and had been oppressed by a feeling of horror, the sense that the whole place was saturated in blood. Mrs. Smith was definitely psychic. Dr. Girdham gives an example. She had been reading about water divining and wanted to know more about it. On impulse, she decided to go out to play cards that evening, feeling that something interesting would develop. Her partner proved to be a wart charmer whose uncle was a water diviner and presumably able to satisfy her curiosity. On her first visit to the Pyrenees, she had experienced the sense of, "I have been here before," quote unquote. On a later visit at Saint Jean Pied de Port, she was able to walk around the old medieval town as if she knew it well, and knew in advance that there would be many steps to climb before she reached the old fortress. She also had a feeling of horror about Toulouse, although she had never been there, and once had a dream in which someone was trying to force her to enter a cathedral called Saint Etienne. She later discovered by chance that the cathedral in Toulouse was called Saint Etienne. Some form of unconscious telepathy began to develop between doctor and patient, although it should be added Mrs. Smith's nightmares had ceased after her first meeting with Dr. Girdham. Quote, on one occasion she received from me a letter containing the identical longish sentence which she herself had written to me, end quote. And on another, the two of them, quite independently, had written on the same day to the author of an article about Catharism, both having stumbled upon the article, again quite independently, in the back number of a specialist journal. It was more than 2 years after their first meeting that Mrs. Smith began to speak openly about her dreams, and the part Dr. Girdham had played in them. And this is certainly the most remarkable and incredible part of the whole story, the part that will prove the major stumbling block to many people who can accept the evidence for Mrs. Smith's previous incarnation. She wrote to Dr. Girdham, quote, I think I was living just outside Toulouse, or maybe in Toulouse itself, when you first came to my house years ago in that snowstorm. We were a very poor family, but you were of noble birth. I fell in love with you then, and my father said I must never meet you again. You were not of our class, and, what was more important to him, you were not of our faith. We were Roman Catholics. I refused to be parted from you and was eventually excommunicated. I went to live with you. We weren't married. You told me that if anything should happen to you, I must go to Fabrica. And that ends the quote. One's first thought on reading this is that Mrs. Smith had developed the usual patient's fixation on the doctor and somehow convinced Dr. Girdham that they had been lovers in the 13th century. In fact, this view cannot be maintained, for Dr. Girdham threw himself into historical research to find just how much of Mrs. Smith's story would stand up to analysis, and the answer is all of it. It must be remembered that although Mrs. Smith had been having circumstantial dreams and visions since her teens, she did not connect them with the Cathars. Her first meeting with Dr. Girdham and immediate recognition of him as Roger, the lover of her visions, was almost her first intimation that it was not all some old trick of her subconscious. She had experienced a sense of déjà vu in the Pyrenees, as already recorded. When he called upon her subsequently in a snowstorm to arrange a hospital appointment, the memory of her first meeting with Roger, also in a snowstorm, returned. The persecution of the Cathars of Toulouse had been a fairly small and localized event, and the Inquisition records still existed. Various names had recurred in Mrs. Smith's dreams: Fabrica, Roger, Elias, Pierre de Mazaroya, and Professor René Nelli, one of the world's greatest authorities on the period. Oh, and Professor René Nelli, one of the greatest authorities on the period, suggested that something might be discovered about them in the records. Mrs. Smith's dreams were full of other details about the period. The poems that Roger had cited, the layout of the hall of the castle, the ceremonies and rituals of the Cathar religion, what they ate and drank, and what kind of utensils were used at table. Dr. Girdham's task, with the help of Professor Nelli and Jean Duvernoy, I know I'm butchering that, Another eminent authority was to check as much of this as possible, and as the investigation proceeded, he became more and more impressed with what he calls the uncanny accuracy of Mrs. Smith's memories. She stated that when Roger was ill, they gave him loaf sugar, and Dr. Girdham found this hard to accept. But Professor Nelly's researches revealed that sugar did exist at that time, although it was a scarce commodity. Mrs. Smith mentioned that it was kept locked up. Girdham discovered that it was regarded as a medicine. Again, Mrs. Smith mentioned that the Cathedral of Saint Etienne in Toulouse. Girdham, who had been there, was convinced that this was a slip, that it was actually called Saint Sernin, which is the name of the church in Toulouse. It was only when he came to revise the script of his book and checked with a guidebook that he realized she was right again. Okay, am I going to stand up for a little bit? I've got 13 pages to go. I am going to stand up for a bit. I'm not going to make you all look at my crotch. I'm going to bring my camera up here. Okay. The story that slowly emerged was as follows. Roger Izarn was a Cathar priest or preacher who traveled around a great deal in the area of Toulouse. He had taken refuge in a snowstorm in the house of a Catholic family, which included the young girl whom Girdham calls Perilia. Oddly enough, Mrs. Smith's dreams did not include her real name. She fell in love with Roger and later attended Cathar meetings at which he was present. They became lovers. When her father found out, he beat her and threw her out of the house. She went to Roger's house and lived with him, but he traveled a great deal and often became ill. Dr. Girdham feels that his symptoms point to tuberculosis. In 1242, 2 inquisitors came to the area searching out heretics. Pierre de Mazaroya, a distant relative of Roger, plotted to kill them. The inquisitors, with their entourage, stayed with one Raymond de Alfar, who sent word to Mazaroya. The inquisitors were murdered in D'Alfar's house. The motive of the crime was to seize lists of heretics, members of respected local families, in possession of the inquisitors. Mrs. Smith dreamed of Pierre de Mazaroya coming into the room where she was asleep, gloating about the murder, and remembered Roger's horror. Catholic reaction to the crime was violent. Roger was among those arrested and interrogated. Prison wrecked his already delicate health, and he died. Perilia was so shattered by the news that she tried to commit suicide by starvation, one of the methods favored by Cathars apparently. Bitter fighting between Cathars and Catholics followed, all of it, like the murder of the inquisitors by Pierre de Mazaroya, a matter of history. Cathars, including Perilia, were held for interrogation in the Cathedral of Saint Etienne. Perilia eventually died at the stake. Mrs. Smith's description of her dream is particularly harrowing. Quote, "I didn't know when you were burnt to death, you'd bleed. I thought the blood would all dry up in the terrible heat, but I was bleeding heavily. The blood was dripping and hissing in the flames. I wished I had enough blood to put the flames out. The worst part was my eyes. I tried to close my eyelids, but I couldn't. They must have been burnt off." End quote. It is not surprising that the trauma of these experiences echoed down 7 centuries. As to the coincidence that Dr. Girdham should have been Roger Isarn de Arborenz, we can only accept it, like the other strange coincidences recorded in the book, as a concomitant of intense psychic activity. Girardin mentions that, quote, in a letter she had mentioned a quotation by some medieval scholar and asked me if I could help her locate it. I could not do so. Just previous to writing a further letter, she had been to the library, picked up a book, and was confronted immediately by the quotation. This kind of thing is a commonplace with people of this type, end quote. That is to say, it is not coincidence, in the ordinary sense of the word, but some kind of psychic radar, about whose nature we know nothing whatsoever. To further complicate an extremely complex issue, it should be added that reincarnation is one of the few matters upon which there is basic disagreement among spiritualists. J.J. Morse, an editor of Two Worlds, wrote down spirit teachings, quote unquote, at the dictation of a spirit named Tien Sien Tie, a 16th century Chinese, and Tien Sien Tie stated flatly that reincarnation is nonsense. He pointed out that if men were brought back to the world to work out a bad karma, then we would have no right to alleviate misery. On the other hand, an eminent spiritualist I consulted told me that some mediums, or rather the spirits that speak through them, accept reincarnation, while others deny it. The Continentals seem more prone to accept it than Anglo-Saxons. All spirit teaching accepts that there are ascending levels in the other world, not unlike Dante's spheres in the Paradiso, and that one's life on earth determines which of these levels becomes one's habitation immediately after death. There is no hell, no punishment, although there are dark places. But spirit teaching generally has little to say on reincarnation. The medium, Dorothy Perkins, was kind enough to put a question on the subject to a spirit known to her circle as the philosopher. The philosopher replied that while he does not deny reincarnation, he has never met anyone on the other side who goes in for it, from which we might infer that the bad karma doctrine is untrue and that reincarnation is a matter of choice for the individual spirit. Let us try to summarize some of the conclusions reached so far. Okay, we've got 10 more pages. Yump and yoizits. Okay. It is certain that human beings possess latent powers of which they are only dimly aware, and that these latent powers produce a variety of phenomena, from poltergeist activity to thought photography and spontaneous combustion. These positive powers are connected to, but not identical with, the power of precognition and of sensing ghosts. Apart from man's own latent powers, there seems to be strong evidence that ghosts have an independent existence. Their chief characteristic appears to be a certain stupidity, since a tendency to hang around places they knew in life would appear to be the spirit world's equivalent of feeble-mindedness. I have suggested elsewhere that the state of mind of ghosts may be similar to that of someone in delirium or high fever. A disconnection of the will and inability to distinguish between reality and dreams. It must also be admitted, although for me personally it goes against the grain to do it, that it is not improbable that the dead may be around us a great deal of the time, and that premonitions of danger, precognitions, and so on, may be due to them rather than to our own psychic alarm system. This view seems to be unsophisticated, so typical of primitive tribes, that I hasten to qualify it by saying that most of the phenomena are explainable on either on either hypothesis. Tyrrell cites the case of a woman who unwrapped a packet of pound notes and went into the kitchen to throw the wrappers in the fire, her mind on other things. As she was about to throw them, she felt a hand laid on her own, pushing it down, and realized she was holding the pound notes instead of the wrapping paper. She was so convinced that someone had touched her that she shouted, "Is anyone there?" No doubt some departed spirit could have been responsible, so could her own subconscious. The notion that the dead are voyeurs is certainly not a pleasing one. Besides, one feels they ought to have something better to do. That's for sure. I don't want Grandma watching me all the time. It should also be borne in mind that the mysteries of the split personality are still unexplored territory for psychology. At least back in 71 they were. Was Yates's a vision dictated by spirits or by some dark side of his personality, operating through his wife's mediumship? Eisenbud has a whole chapter on this question entitled Who's in the Back of the Store? And he explains elsewhere in the book that he often asked Sirius under hypnosis, "Who are you?" in the hope of finding some alien alter ego. He suspected a rebellious small boy, but there are cases where the ordinary alter ego theory seems to break down. For example, that of Jose Pedro de Freitas, reported by Frank Smythe in Man, Myth, and Magic, number 8, a Brazilian peasant who at the age of 32 in 1950 was taken over by the spirit of a German surgeon who had been killed in the First World War. Dr. Freitas, de Freitas, operated with a kitchen knife, scissors, a scalpel, and a pair of tweezers. Dr. Ledera Marquez of Rio de Janeiro described an operation as follows, and there's a fairly long quote. The patient lay on an old door, and scissors, scalpel, a kitchen knife, and tweezers stood nearby in an old empty can. Without the help of a speculum, an instrument for dilating the cavities of the human body for inspection, he introduced 3 scissors and 2 scalpels into the vagina brusquely, one can even say with violence. He was holding one hand of the scissors when all of us saw the other hand start moving along, opening and closing the scissors. Although we could not see whether this was also the case with the other instruments, we could all clearly hear the noise of metals rattling and the characteristic sounds of tissue being cut. After a few minutes, Dr. Fritz removed the scissors, and at the sight of blood stopped and said, "Let there be no blood, Lord," and the operation continued with no further hemorrhage at all. End quote. Okay, interesting. The other witnesses were Dr. Ari Lex, lecturer at Sao Paulo University and member of the State Medical Academy, Dr. Oswald Conrado, director of the State Hospital in Sao Paulo, and Dr. Lita de Castro of Rio de Janeiro. De Freitas went on to remove the tumor from the womb of the young woman, who remained conscious, and sealed the cut by pressing the edges together. The whole operation took only a few minutes. Dr. Freitas seems to be able to produce a state of total relaxation in the patients, and they felt no pain. He seems to have been in some kind of trance himself during the operations, for when shown a photograph of one of them afterwards, he was sick. Between 1950 and 1964, Dr. Freitas performed hundreds of similar operations, always at lightning speed, always with a kind of casual carelessness, and always successfully. He also showed an uncanny skill in diagnosis. In 1964, however, he was charged under Article 284 of the Brazilian Code, which states spirit healing to be a crime. Brazil is, of course, a rigidly Catholic country, and sentenced to 16 months in prison. He has apparently given up his operations since then. Accounts like this make all attempts at speculation seem a waste of time. If it is true, then we had better acknowledge that we are little better than children and adopt some of the observant open-mindedness that is characteristic of children. Before leaving this subject of other worlds, we should consider briefly a hypothesis that has steadily gained support in the past 2 decades. That we are under observation by intelligences from outer space. Flying saucers have become something of a joke, understandably. Among my own small library on the subject are titles like The Flying Saucer Menace, Why Are They Watching Us?, The Invasion from Outer Space, and the general air of sensationalism repels serious inquirers. On the other hand, David Foster's intelligent universe hypothesis suggests that wherever there is already life, it is likely to evolve to higher levels of intelligence. You do not have to be a science fiction writer to imagine that if there are highly intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe, they would exercise caution in making themselves known to us. We know what happens when the civilized white man goes among primitive tribes, whether in Australia, Africa, or America. Even when the colonizers are well-meaning, the result is always the same: the destruction of the primitive culture. If the white races were more advanced, they would make laws to prevent this kind of brutal incursion into primitive cultures. And if extraterrestrial intelligences exist, they have no doubt already done just that. Scientists have now begun systematic investigation into life on other planets or stars. In April 1960, the 85-foot radio telescope at Deer Creek Valley in West Virginia was directed toward various stars that may have planets, hoping to pick up radio signals that would indicate intelligent life. Although the project was abandoned after a few months, a conference of scientists was held at Green Bank, West Virginia, the following year to discuss the topic of extraterrestrial life. Although it was not kept secret, it was not advertised either. Nobody wanted sensational reports in newspapers. The whole project, it may be noted, was government-sponsored. In late 1962, the Soviet Academy of Sciences published a book by an eminent astronomer, Joseph Shklovsky, discussing these problems seriously, and in 1965, not long after a Soviet conference on extraterrestrial civilizations, a colleague of Shklovsky's reported that the star CTA 102 was emitting radio signals that suggested intelligence. On June 17, 1908, there occurred in central Siberia, Tunguska, in central Siberia, an event that must be regarded as one of the oldest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. What appeared to be an enormous meteor streaked northward across the sky. It could be seen for thousands of square miles. It struck close to a river called the Stony Tunguska, the adjective being used to distinguish it from two brothers, the Lower and Upper Tunguskas. A pillar of fire rose into the air, turning it into a mushroom-shaped black cloud. The explosion was heard more than 600 miles away. 2 villages were wiped out, but the meteor had fortunately crashed in a relatively uninhabited area, and most of the damage with a 20-mile radius was to trees. The next day, there were high silvery clouds. And I think now the theory is that it actually, whatever it was, exploded above ground, it didn't strike ground and explode. But anyway, in 1908, the government had more to worry about than earthquakes, which is what they probably assumed it was. It was not until 1927 that an expedition succeeded in penetrating the almost roadless area near the source of the Podkamenaya Tunguska, where there was evidence of an immense explosion, trees blown down with their tops pointing outward from the explosion, all of them burned. The Space Encyclopedia lists the explosion under meteorites along with the Arizona meteorite, the Sikhote Alin meteorite of 1947, and various others. But the Tunguska meteor had certain very peculiar features. The evidence revealed that it exploded in midair like a hydrogen bomb, as Willie Ley remarks in his History of Astronomy. Watchers of the Skies, and in his History of Astronomy, Watchers of the Skies. And there were no meteor fragments such as were found in abundance at the Sikhote Alin site, 30 tons of it. Willie Ley, unhappy about the idea of a nuclear explosion, suggests that the meteor may have been made of antimatter, which seems to be even more far-fetched. I wonder if it could have been dark matter, though. Is dark matter considered antimatter? I don't know. That is not a question for me to answer. The late dark... I hate it when I completely throw a unrelated word in there. The late Frank Edwards, after mentioning that a subsequent expedition under a Dr. Kazantsev found radioactivity in the soil, draws the conclusion that this was probably the explosion of a flying saucer, and there would seem to be at least a 50% probability that he is right. Much of the evidence for unidentified flying objects must be regarded as untrustworthy due to a vivid imagination, self-hypnotism, or the desire for publicity. As to the assertion of various writers that references to flying objects can be found in ancient manuscripts, that must be regarded as unproven. It is true that Ezekiel's cloud with a brightness around it and fire flashing, and this is all a quote, sorry, fire flashing continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming bronze, sounds as if it could be a flying, gleaming bronze, end quote, sounds as if it could be a flying saucer, but it could also be just a prophetic vision. The same applies to a quote-unquote circle of fire that was coming in the sky, mentioned in an Egyptian papyrus of the time of Thutmose III, about 1500 BC, and the, quote, two large shields, reddish in color, in motion above the church, end quote, described in the Saxon Annales Lauricenses for the year AD 776. The American Air Force, which has been closely involved in UFO investigations since 1947, when Kenneth Arnold, an American businessman, saw 6 saucers flying in the area of Mount Rainier near Seattle, affirms that between 70 and 90% of the sightings can be explained by conventional effects, and responsible investigators are inclined to accept this estimate. But there remains an undismissible residue of 10% or so that demands to be taken seriously. The most famous of these is the Mantell case of January 7, 1948, when the military police notified the Goodman base of the U.S. Air Force at Fort Knox, Kentucky, of the presence of a flying object over the town. 3 F-51 pursuit planes took off. They followed the disc and saw that it had a top shaped like a cone with a red light blinking on it. Captain Thomas F. Mantell got closest to it and reported back that it was increasing speed and gaining height. Then his plane disintegrated in midair. The flying object was seen before and after the disaster by hundreds of people in Madison, Indiana, Fort Knox, and Columbus, Ohio. But what have flying saucers to do with the occult? Carl Jung establishes one link that he speculates, in a short book on flying saucers, that the worldwide sightings of UFOs may be the expression of a quote-unquote a wave of hope in the reappearance of Christ, a universal longing for some apocalyptic second coming. Jung's theory, wild enough for science fiction, is that the flying objects have an objective existence, but as projections from the racial unconscious mind, like the monsters of Forbidden Planet. In that case, flying saucers might be regarded as being related to specters of the living, but this view is contradicted by some of the phenomena. For example, when I was living in Roanoke, Virginia, in 1966 and 67, a motorist reported discovering a flying saucer in the middle of the road late at night. The police investigated, and the report was confirmed to the extent that a large patch of the road at the point where the saucer had been showed melted tar. Jung's theory cannot explain this, and many other pieces of commonplace factual evidence in the reports. The possibility of more direct links between flying objects and the occult was drawn to my attention in 1967 by the San Francisco poet Richard Roberts. He had already spoken to me about a remarkable Dutch yogi named Jack Schwartz, born in 1924 in Dordrecht, near Rotterdam, also the birthplace of Peter Hurkos. And it was after this first mention of Schwartz that he told me that the yogi was worried about some very odd events that had been taking place. A woman under hypnosis had begun to speak in a metallic voice and had informed him that he was actually from Pluto and that his metallic informant, was a Venusian, and this apparently was not the first time he had received similar messages. It all sounded very odd, very cranky, almost certainly some kind of self-delusion. However, I asked Dick Roberts if he would be kind enough to write down for me the story of Jack Schwartz, as circumstantially as possible, and he obliged with a 9-page typescript, which I shall summarize here. Schwartz was introduced to Dick Roberts as a Sufi, but he denied this, saying that he was only a Sufi in the sense of possessing a spiritual force that worked through him. They got along so well that Schwartz invited Roberts to stay with him for a few days in Upland, California. Quote, on this visit, I discovered that he slept only 2 hours each night and ate approximately 4 meals a week. At 7 each morning, his day began with persons arriving every half hour until noon for messages, ostensibly to satisfy the state of California's medical licensing laws. Oh, massages. I read it as messages for massages. In addition to the massage, however, what these people were receiving was psychic and spiritual counseling, and often hypnotic and healing treatments. Afternoons were given to his family and to preparations for evening lectures, which he gave around the greater Los Angeles area. Returning from these during the week that I visited him, we would talk together until 3 a.m., when he would go into meditation for an hour and then to bed at 4. At 7, the front doorbell would ring for the first counseling. To quote Roberts, and this is a lengthy quote, like almost a page, quote, his friends impressed me with their eyes-open approach to psychical research and with their basically good mental health, a rare thing in the area of gurus preying upon the emotionally dependent. I was also impressed with Jack's near encyclopedic knowledge of the occult and convinced that he was a force for the good. Nearly a year later, I witnessed his bed of nails demonstration, which he formerly used in introducing his lectures. The nails, a dozen or so in number, protruded from a thin wooden frame. Unlike the familiar yogi's bed, they are sharp, long 4 to 6 inches, and widely separated so that the weight of the body is supported by only a few nails. Except for trunks, he is naked for the demonstration. The heaviest man in the audience is selected and asked to stand upon his body as he reclines on the nails. On this particular evening, I assisted a man who weighed nearly 250 pounds onto Jack's chest. I then saw one of the nails pierce his calf and come out some 3 inches on the other side, but there was no bleeding from the wound. Subsequently, he got up and walked through the audience, allowing any and all to examine the deep holes in his back. A doctor was present and examined one hole with a probe, stating that the depth was about 1/2 of an inch. At no time was there any bleeding from the punctures. The import of his following lecture was that matter at a low rate of vibration is solid, whereas at a high rate of vibration it is subtle. Thus, for physical and spiritual health, one needs to raise one's vibrations. How is this accomplished? Although there are many paths to God, Jack stresses meditation techniques. By the end of his lectures, the punctures had disappeared from his back. End quote. Okay, we're getting there. Dick Roberts then offers a biographical summary of Schwartz. As a child and youth, he could see the colors of people's psychic auras. He became a hypnotist and worked on the stage. Subsequently, he worked in the Dutch resistance. The curious intimations about other planets apparently began in 1958 when Schwartz was a welfare officer on the Dutch ship New Holland, going through the Suez Canal to Indonesia with 2,000 soldiers on board. Everyone was watching a magician who had been brought on board to entertain. Quote, "I was on the bridge of the ship," said Schwartz in a taped interview with Dick Roberts, when suddenly a tall, lanky Arab in a striped robe appeared and went down on his knees before me and kissed my feet, saying, "You are my master." End quote. Oh, you are my master. Not end quote. Then, just like that, he got up and walked out. Naturally, I tried to follow him because it was poor security to allow him on the bridge, or even on the ship, unless he was connected with the entertainment. But he had disappeared. I checked with the watch at the gangway, and no one of his description had been seen coming aboard or leaving, and he was not connected with the magician. All those people had been accounted for. And that's the actual end quote. Sorry. In 1959, Schwartz continues. He was living in Los Angeles with his wife. He was invited to attend a lecture on hypnosis at Whittier. As they left the lecture, a woman approached their group saying, quote, "A man wants to talk to you," end quote. Oh. So then we have another very lengthy quote here. Quote, "He was sitting at the wheel of a green station wagon, and as we walked up, Bill said, 'You want to speak to us?' 'Not you, him,' said the man, pointing at me. 'Get in the car.' His manner was very abrupt, and he seemed a little angry, so my wife said, 'Don't do it, Jack,' but I told her to go along with Bill because I wanted to hear what he had to say, and I told her not to worry. He wasn't very big, about 5'6", slight, with a toupee. The way you knew it was false was because the wax was sticking out from under the hair. He didn't look very dangerous. As soon as I got into the car, he grabbed my hand. 'It's all right. I just want to be sure I have the right man. Once before I got the wrong man, but from your vibration I know you are the right man.' Then he kisses my hand. I looked at him like, 'What the heck is this? Once before I kissed you, but I kissed your feet. Do you remember? I told you you were my master.' Looking at the man in the car now, I could see no connection between him and the tall Arab, but then he began to tell me details of this incident which I had told to no one else. He must have been reading my mind, because I was thinking it could not be the same man when he said, 'We can appear in any shape or form we desire. I have just come from Australia, and before that I was in Nepal, where your master is. I bring you a message from him. How do you get the idea I have a master?' 'Because we come from a tribe of people who crash-landed in a rocket ship on Earth thousands of years ago. My code name is XB15, and you are my master. The message from your master is that you should now begin teaching the spiritual truth that is being given to you inspirationally. You are God's vehicle to bring the truth that is meant to be. That's all I have to tell you. You can go now. I will get in touch with you again.'" And that's the end of that long quote. All right, we're almost there. We've got about 2.5 pages to go. The remainder of the story to date is odd and rather frustrating. A phone message purported to come from Reverend Elvira Schreider, but when Schwartz phoned the only man by that name in the phone book, he denied all knowledge of the call. But 2 weeks later, the man with the toupee rang up to congratulate Schwartz, telling him that he had been chosen to be a member of a steering council of the new age. He gave Schwartz 11 other names, one of which was Elvira Schreider. In 1966, after attending a lecture on flying saucers and the language of their occupants, Schwartz's meditations were constantly interrupted by 4 syllables that sounded like El Su Sheila, and afterwards he felt dazed. He made inquiries with the group who were responsible for the lecture on saucer language and was told that the syllables meant God's vehicle is, and this is a quote, God's vehicle to bring truth that is meant to be, end quote. It was after that the hypnotic messages came. The first was through a woman patient who suddenly began to speak in a metallic voice, informed him that he was from Pluto and that he, the voice, was from Venus and was called Linus. Linus added that Venusians were composed of a gaseous substance. The scientific detail that the hypnotized woman proceeded to give about Venusian life would have been completely beyond her normal intellectual capacity. She was amazed when the tape was played back to her. 2 months later, Linus again made contact through a hypnotized patient. Schwartz does not go into detail about the message, and finally, a psychic girl in Vancouver told him out of the blue that she had traveled astrally to Venus the previous night and had seen him there with Linus. She mentioned the name. She added that he was instructing the Venusians because he was from a higher plane than theirs, and that to date is the last contact Jack Schwartz has had with his Venusian friend Linus. Again, 1971. I would be the first to agree that the story is one of the weirdest in this volume. With the talk about God's vehicle on earth and so on, it bears all the signs of ordinary religious monomania, the kind of thing from which hundreds of people get committed to asylums every year. But there are several factors here that incline me to reject this view. I have not met Schwartz, but Dick Roberts described him as a very solid, ordinary kind of person, quite unguru-like. This is borne out by Schwartz's own comments on all this. Quote, by this time, I was beginning to get upset by the whole thing. I was happy with my wife and children, and I was not interested in steering the spaceship, or even going along for a short ride. I was very happy to stay on Earth as ordinary Jack Schwartz, end quote. This rings true. So does the inconclusiveness of the whole weird story. Schwartz has not tried to set himself up as God's vehicle or to teach spiritual truth inspirationally. He has remained ordinary Jack Schwartz, a highly gifted psychic with remarkable talents as a fakir. Neither of these faculties necessarily indicate great spiritual advancement. In India, fakirs, men able to perform remarkable feats of physical self-control, are regarded as being a lower level than the God-obsessed yogis. The probability is that Jack Schwartz is genuine, that he believes every word of his story as it appears above. There remains, of course, the equally plausible hypothesis that the events are an example of Jung's psychic projection, that is, the active interference of the subconscious mind in everyday life. We all know how unexpected and alien dreams can be. Could this not be an example of the subconscious manifesting itself physically, as, for example, when Jung produced explosions to disconcert Freud? This hypothesis strikes me as altogether more likely, certainly in the case of the metallic voice speaking from hypnotized patients, but it does not cover XB-15 in the car or the Arab on the ship. Let us for a moment make the assumption that the whole story is literally true. It is staggering, but no more strange than many things we have discussed in this volume. In fact, it suggests some tentative unifying principles. If we can accept reincarnation, then there is nothing surprising in the idea of Jack Schwartz being the reincarnation of a traveler from Pluto. The idea that he is teaching on Venus when his earthly body is asleep in bed may sound strange until we reflect that in 90% of cases of astral projection, the projector has no idea that he's left his body, as in the case of Poise or Yeats already cited. Schwartz's theory of vibration sounds very close to David Foster's. Explaining the theory to me in a letter, David Foster wrote, using capital letters to emphasize his point, quote, "The universe is a total construction of waves and vibrations whose inner content is meaning, and man is a microsystem of the same vibratory nature floating at some depth in the universal and meaningful wave system. The universal wave system is qualitative or value structured. This is quantum theory. According to its vibration rate spectrum, faster frequencies have more information capacity." End quote. He goes on to remark that the dualism of mind and matter is a false one, since all is mind and meaning, and we assume that body is matter, simply because its frequencies are too fast for our minds to understand and analyze. In fact, the human body understands the meaning in nature directly by harmonic resonance. Quote, "And how on earth could the human body control its fantastic chemical complexities unless it was all mind? But the human mind is a vibratory system that operates so slowly that it is capable of analysis of thus of synthesis, and so can partake in your step-by-step thinking operations." End quote. He goes on to say that the mind is a radio set that can tune in to thousands of different vibrations in the ether. We only have to think of Poise or Wordsworth to see what he means. In poetic experience, the mind becomes oddly negative, open, tuning in to vibrations that it normally cuts out for the purposes of getting on with everyday life. Obviously, the most incredible part of Jack Schwartz's story, because the least substantiated, is the talk about Venus, Pluto, and so on. This is not a priori more incredible than Arthur Gurdam's story of the Cathars and reincarnation, or the various cases already discussed, but the evidence there is strong, and there is no evidence whatever for Jack Schwartz's assertion, or Linus's, that life forms on Venus are gaseous, although space probes indicate that the surface of Venus is too hot to support life, and that the upper atmosphere is filled with vapors. On the day I'm writing this, a Soviet space probe is due to make a soft landing on Venus, but I doubt whether it will do anything to confirm or contradict Linus's assertion. As to the statement that Jack Schwartz originated on Pluto, the outermost of the planets, there is nothing to contradict this in our knowledge of the solar system. Millions of years ago, Pluto must have been as warm as the Earth is now, and undoubtedly could support life. If this life managed to evolve to a high level without destroying itself, it may have learned the secret of staying alive on a planet that is now around minus 230 degrees centigrade, only 43 degrees above absolute zero. Its density is the highest in the solar system, about 50 grams per cubic centimeter, which almost certainly means that any beings who lived on it would have had denser bodies than human beings. If David Foster is correct about his vibrational system, this would also imply a higher level of powers than most humans possess. But all this, of course, is mere guesswork. If other planets and their inhabitants were involved in the chain of reincarnation, it would certainly simplify some awkward problems. For example, how the present population of the Earth could be so many times greater than it ever has been in previous centuries. Did the souls in the next world have to form a queue waiting for a body? No doubt space travel will eventually provide an answer. Meanwhile, we can at least regard it as an entertaining speculation. And that is finally the end of that chapter. It took 3 readings, and this one is an extra long reading. We've got one more chapter to go, and I think I'm going to have to do it in 2 readings. Even though it is a bit shorter, it is still 40-some pages, so it's starting on 538, going to 582. So yeah, 44 pages. So I will have to break it up too. We'll do 22 pages each reading. All right, so I am going to try to get my list of books for the poll up on X sometime tomorrow. So we'll see what y'all want to hear me read next. Until tomorrow night, have a good one.
My heart is beating, I know the pieces. Which one is broken and one is weak? Because I have seen you fall apart. I have no rules about the play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. If you leave it behind, someone will break it. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used it and abused it. You left me all shot inside. Was my love true? Was it that? You had no answers at all. Don't know without you, how will I survive? Alone. You had no answers at all. Don't know without you, how will I survive? Alone. My heart is beating, I know the pieces. Which one is broken and one is weak? Because I have seen you fall apart. I have no rules about the play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. see that abused me. You left me all shocked and soft. Was my love untrue? Was it doubt? You had no answers at all. Don't know without you how will I survive alone. My heart is beating, I know the pieces. Which one is broken and one is weak? Because I have seen it fall apart. I have no rules about the blame. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. If you leave it behind, someone will break me. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used it that abused me. You left me all shocked and soft. Was my love untrue? Was it doubt? You had no answers at all. Don't know without you how will I survive alone. Alone with broken heart. Alone with broken heart. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. If you leave it behind, someone will break me. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used it that abused me. You left me all shocked and soft. Was my love untrue? Was it doubt? You had no answers at all. Don't know without you how will I survive alone. My heart is beating, I know the pieces. Which one is broken and one is weak? Because I have seen it fall apart. I have no rules about the blame. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. My heart is beating, I know the pieces. Which one is broken and one is weak? Because I have seen you fall apart. I have no rules apart to play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake it. If you leave it behind, someone will break it. I left you my heart, what did you do? You used it and abused it. You left me all shy inside. Was my love true? Was it that bad? You had no answers, don't know